If you've heard of barefoot shoes and are wondering what the hype is, then you probably also heard about the debate going on about barefoot shoes and wearing conventional shoes. Now, are these modern sneakers helping us stand tall and strong, or are they slowly turning our feet into weak, poorly functional tools? Today, we're going to be looking at all the evidence out there and whether you should be ditching your sneakers for barefoot shoes. Welcome back to Peak Performance Hacks, and I'm your host, Doctor Gan, where we explore the tools, the habits, and sometimes even the footwear that help you stay focused, energized, and on top of your game. Today, we're talking about feet and specifically about footwear and how they keep you balanced, upright, and moving forward. And are the barefoot shoes the secret to unlocking your peak performance, or is this just another fad? Now, let's dive in. To start off with, I would say that we have to go way back. We have to look at the history of shoes in order to understand where they came up from and where we are in this moment. Shoes have been around from about 7,000 to 8,000 BC, and there are also images or pictures that have been painted in caves from much earlier. Initially, the main purpose of wearing shoes was to actually protect the feet, and I would almost argue that that's probably stands true even in this modern day. We started with sandals made from natural products to then evolve into rubber, leather, and even composite material that has been used for regular walking as well as for various sports. Not to mention the fashion status with different shoes, especially the high heels for women, and also pointy leather shoes that a lot of people wear, including myself, and I'm guilty of that at some point of time. Now, as time went on, it became a fashion status to be more lavish, and they had gold embroidery, and it was a lot more detailed, especially during the time of the Romans. And then later with time, and especially in the 70s, it became a thing where athletes were actually wearing specific shoes in order for them to run faster, in order for them to play certain sports. And I always remember that ad, which was for Nike, whereby it was "Be Like Mike." And I remember really waiting for that period where I could actually purchase these Air Jordans, and that would actually make me jump a lot faster, go a lot quicker, and maybe make shots just like Michael Jordan. Now, I can say that marketing ploy really worked, because somehow I almost felt that I was actually running a lot faster and even jumping a lot higher, but clearly that may have been a placebo effect. Plus that idea that I actually wanted to emulate my superstar just like Michael Jordan. Now, with that being said, what is the concept of shoes? Now, the modern day shoe has a lot of criteria that it has to actually meet. One of them is to actually protect our feet from sharp objects and also the elements, whether it be a hot ground or a rough surface, and just to protect those soles of our feet. It would also be important for shoes to actually support the arches, the ankles, and even our heels from impact, especially if we were running or taking part in activities where we're jumping quite a lot, because we're trying to protect the ankles, also protect the knees, and essentially protect the hips as well. And then when you take it down a notch for people that generally walk from every age all the way to the elderly, it has to provide stability when we walk as well, and ensure that we're actually standing nice and tall and we're standing with a good gait. Now, when you look at other factors, increasing the efficiency of what we do, such as walking, running, and even playing certain sports, was really what they were marketing when you looked at Nike, Adidas, even Reebok at the time, to ensure that we were actually performing at the best level by wearing specific shoes made for that sport. These days, with the cushioning that these shoes provide, it's gone past just efficiency, it's gone past just stability, and even gone past sporting as well. And now it's come into its new realm of feeling really comfortable. I remember buying my first Ultra Boost maybe about 3 years ago from Adidas, and I almost felt I was walking on clouds because that's how comfortable it felt. Unfortunately, there is another area that often gets missed. The foot is actually full of ligaments and small little muscles, some of them small, some of them a lot bigger, and it supports the ankle, the foot, and even the legs. You have to remember that the muscles in your leg, the anterior component at the front, as well as the posterior compartment near your calves, is very essential for the strength of your lower body complex. And for that reason, I would say that just like any muscle, if you don't work it enough or you don't utilize it enough, it actually gets weaker until at some point you may start to get injuries, or it may affect your gait as a result of these muscles not being used. Now, when you wear shoes that compress the front of your feet as well, they push your toes in, and your big toe and your smallest toe pushed in, it then can affect your gait as well. And this transmission of force from the bottom all the way up can affect the knees, the hips, and even the spine. Now, as I mentioned, that toe box is absolutely critical when it comes to the functioning of your feet, because if you don't have a wide enough base, then you don't have as much stability. And this is something that commonly happens with elderly people, because as they get older, they lose the ability to then have stability in their feet. And therefore, the ability for your toes to actually splay out and be wide gives you more stability. Let's not also forget the whole idea behind fashion. And at one point, people are actually taping their feet in China because it almost looked like a fashionable thing to have these pointy looking feet. Now, the reality is, for women or even some men that wear high heels, or I used to own a pair of shoes that were really pointy, it looked like it was a fashionable thing to do, but it often wasn't very good for your feet. Another very important point is that our feet have millions of sensory points that are sending signals through the feet all the way up to your brain, and it happens almost at an unconscious level. And this is what is known as proprioception, whereby our body is sending signals in order for us to have feet that are stable and allowing our bodies and even our feet to move in a very flexible manner. Some of the signals may include the fact that when we're going up a hill, we'll know that we're actually going up terrain. When we're stepping on something sharp, it's sending signals to move those muscles to actually protect ourselves. And that is where proprioception becomes a very big factor. And unfortunately, when you wear shoes that are extensively padded, we then sort of lose that ability to get that sensory feedback from the ground above. And this could eventually then lead to lots of injury. So what do the studies and research actually show? Based on some of the systematically reviewed studies, the evidence has been a little bit uncertain. Some of them are actually shown that barefoot shoes are actually not that good for you in terms of causing more injury, especially in your ankles. And on the other hand, they've said it actually strengthens your ankles and it strengthens the muscles in your feet, therefore improving your plantar flexion. They did, however, look at some athletes that transitioned from regular shoes into barefoot shoes and went into a training program. And then they looked at them to see whether their performance increased. And what they found was that it did not actually increase by using barefoot shoes. And therefore, I feel that with a lot of these studies, especially when it comes down to how they utilized it, the bigger problem is that when you go from wearing regular shoes into transitioning into barefoot shoes, there is a propensity to injure yourself because of the fact that you've had all this support, especially into your arches, into your ankles as well. And all of a sudden, you go from that to having no support at all, which then could lead into more injury as time goes on. Now, this goes without saying, if you ever decided to go into barefoot shoes, there will be a transition period that you will have to consider rather than just ditching all your sneakers and going straight into it. Now, what do I think about the practical usage? Some of the benefits that I saw was that, and these are based on some of my personal experience using them, plus some of the studies out there, is that you have a better sort of sensation or feedback from your feet up to your brain. Now, it is very subtle initially, but as time goes on, you will then recognize that you actually enjoy that feeling of feeling different surfaces, whether it's a rough surface, whether it's sharp surfaces, whether it's hot, whether it's cold. The idea behind barefoot shoes is that you're actually having a protective layer, so you shouldn't feel something poking straight into it, but it is a very thin protective layer, and therefore you are going to feel sharp objects, especially if you don't even have a little sole in it, because for some people, they actually remove the sole and go completely barefoot shoes, whereby they can feel every undulation on the surface that they're walking. But I found that getting that sensory feedback of feeling different surfaces, whether it's soft, whether it's rough, actually felt quite good. That tactile feeling when you have that sensation is something that I did not think I would enjoy as much as I did. And it just felt like I was more connected with the ground than before, because with most shoes, you kind of just feel like you're walking tall and you're walking high and you have no connection. The next point I would say that was a benefit was that your toes can actually open up a lot better. You feel like you can splay them out rather than being crushed in a narrow toe box. And that sensation of being able to curl my toes and even plantar flex was actually quite pleasurable, in the sense that it felt like I wasn't wearing any shoes. And there are studies to show that it actually promotes or increases the strength within those muscles and plantar flexion, and therefore it can be quite beneficial. When you wear regular shoes, this is something that you can't do, and you almost feel like you're in a rigid box. You can't really move your toes as much. You can't actually move your feet, because the whole idea is that your arches are supported by the padding within them. One of the other benefits that I found was balance and posture. Now, for many years, I've noticed that when I wear sneakers, when I go for runs or even exercising or weight training, I was finding that there was an element whereby my feet were actually moving inwards or pronating, whereby they actually bend inwards. So when you take on heavy weights, whether you're doing squats and your feet are going inwards, unfortunately, the power, the force that's transmitted from the ground upwards is going all the way up your leg, up to your knees, and up to your hips. And unfortunately, this can then lead to other injuries later on, whether it comes down to overuse injury in your knees and even in your hips. These are subtle changes, because when you're young, you don't think much of it because you're just lifting that heavy weight. But as you get a bit older, you'll find that all of a sudden your knees are starting to get sore, or your hips are starting to get sore, and you may lead to other injuries that come down the track. When I started using barefoot shoes, especially for exercises or even weight training, I became a lot more conscious on how I stood and where that force when I was squatting was. And now this takes a little bit of proprioception, as I mentioned earlier, and for the fact that you have to be conscious of where your feet are standing and how stable you are on the ground. But it's not all roses when it comes down to barefoot shoes. And again, this is my experience and other people might feel differently. But some of the disadvantages that I felt was that when you initially transition into barefoot shoes, a lot of people find that you can have sore legs, sore feet, even sore ankles, because of the fact that there's not enough cushioning, there's not much padding around the arches, and there's also not much stability holding those feet in. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the fact is you've been wearing these padded shoes that have been holding your feet in a rigid manner since you were a child, and changing over into shoes that don't have any of the support can almost make those little muscles that weren't used having to work a lot harder than they've ever had to. And so there's always a bit of a transition period. And for that reason, a lot of people may feel soreness. Now, the bigger problem is that if you don't transition over time and you start going into sports where you're running or you're jumping, then this can then lead into injuries, as I mentioned earlier. It's crazy to think that for the longest time, we've had all this support, and this losing it overnight is a big deal, especially for your feet. Also, another challenge is that if you're doing activities whereby you're actually putting a lot of force in, whether playing sports, jumping, running, then there's a risk of you developing plantar fasciitis or even Achilles tendonitis, just because of the result of the sheer force that you're putting on the leg without much support. And again, you have to remember that it changes the dynamics of your running and also your walking, because oftentimes when you have that padded cushioning, you're usually coming quite strongly down with your heel first, rather than actually walking in your midfoot section as you would normally walk, because of that flexion ability when you don't have that much padding. Just think about how you walk when you're not wearing shoes versus when you're actually wearing shoes and have all that cushioning. So what are my thoughts about wearing barefoot shoes? Just like the research out there, I'm 50-50 with it. And the reason for this is that I actually do enjoy the feeling of wearing them. I prefer to be barefoot, to be honest, but obviously for professional reasons and also for the fact of safety of my feet, I would wear shoes that feel comfortable. And I think barefoot shoes work, especially for training, walking, or even casually, but I don't really enjoy wearing it for basketball or running or certain sports like that. At least for now, I've tried it with running, and I quite enjoy the padding that I get with my runners versus wearing barefoot shoes. Now, this might change in the future depending on how I feel, but at the moment, I think wearing barefoot shoes as well as my regular sneakers works for me. And I should mention that for a lot of my training that I do, especially when it comes to weight training and also a lot of activity with stretching, I often do it without shoes anyway. And so I haven't seen the big benefit in being completely barefoot, using barefoot shoes versus the regular sneakers. And I should also mention the fact that a lot of my sneakers that I use actually have a really wide toe box. And so that the constriction that many people would get when they wear certain shoes, I don't get as much because of the fact that I have these wide toed shoes. Should you change over for peak performance to barefoot shoes and join the barefoot revolution? Honestly, if you've ever heard me speak here before on my show or watch this, you can almost predict what I'm about to say. I believe that there is room to wear both for different circumstances, and I don't think you have to go all in one. And I also don't believe that it's going to make the biggest difference when it comes down to your peak performance. It really comes down to another missing element that a lot of people don't do, and that's really stretching and also strengthening exercises for your feet and your ankles. Now, for the same reason that people often get injured, whether wearing normal or regular sneakers or barefoot shoes, is the fact that their ankles are not strong enough. And if you actually spend the time to strengthen these ankles and do exercises, then the chances are whether you wear barefoot shoes or you wear regular sneakers is not going to make as much a difference. And so I believe there's always room to have both. If you decide that despite this, you want to try it out and you want to go the barefoot revolution and try barefoot shoes, there's a couple of things you have to remember. As I mentioned earlier, multiple times, you need to transition into it. So go slowly. Start off wearing it for about 10 minutes a day, and then wearing your regular sneakers or shoes, and then slowly increase it to 20 minutes. Start with walking, start on a surface that is not too undulated or rough, and just walking on grass or even walking on a solid surface would be where I would start. Now, be mindful that if you feel any pain or you feel aching, this is quite normal, but don't push through it, and relax your legs or go back to your regular sneakers if you're feeling that it's becoming more uncomfortable. This is where injuries can occur. And especially if you decide to do running or other sports, go very slowly before you start increasing the intensity, because again, I don't want you to get injured. More importantly, as I mentioned earlier, do a lot of stretching, do a lot of activities to strengthen those feet while you're going through this transition process, because it will speed up the process and you'll feel a lot more comfortable either wearing barefoot shoes or even wearing your regular sneakers. In my opinion, there's always room for both, so I wouldn't be too fixated on the idea of whether you should be spending money to get barefoot shoes or wearing your regular sneakers. I hope this helps, and until next time, speak soon. This wraps up this episode of Peak Performance Hacks. All the links and resources are in the video description or in the resource section, whether it is on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you're watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a review so that more people can discover our podcast and it could benefit them as well. Until I catch you next time, speak soon.